Hello everyone. Before we start, make sure to like and subscribe to the channel and leave a comment with where you're from and what time you're watching. That way, YouTube will keep showing you stories just like this one. They say the worst secrets are the ones hidden inside families, the kind you can't find in textbooks or court records, the kind whispered about in half-broken voices, passed down through generations like a curse. Tonight's story is one of those secrets. A name long erased, a bloodline deliberately forgotten, and a girl who should never have been born. Some claim she was the most inbred child in recorded history. Others say she was proof that human nature, when left unchecked, can rot into something darker than we dare imagine. In the crumbling backwoods of early America, where forgotten cabins leaned like skeletons against the trees, a family lived in silence. They were not poor, but they were not welcome. They were not sick, but they were not healthy. And among them, there was a child whose very existence came to embody their decay. She was known only by the cruel whispers of those who dared to look at her too long, her father's baby. The child's story begins not in a hospital, not in a church, but in a house where the walls themselves seemed ashamed. Her mother was her father's daughter. Her birth was the consequence of a cycle so suffocating, so repetitive, that the word family stopped meaning anything at all. Blood had folded back onto itself, generation after generation, until it no longer resembled the lifeline it was meant to be. Neighbors knew something was wrong. They spoke in hushed tones of the girl's face, how it carried traits too similar, eyes too far apart, jaw too narrow, skin too pale. She seemed like a reflection of her own family's sickness carved into a body that never asked for it. Yet the family kept her hidden, almost as if ashamed of their own creation, yet unable to stop what they'd started. But here's the question that has haunted historians and investigators for years. Was she truly the most inbred girl to ever live? Or was her story buried because it revealed something even darker, something the community, and perhaps America itself, wanted to erase? This is where our story begins. The records of her life are scarce, almost as though someone tried to burn away every trace of her existence, and yet fragments remain, letters, newspaper clippings, whispers recorded in local histories that no one was supposed to read. When pieced together, they form a portrait more horrifying than any fiction, because what happened inside that household was not an accident, not a single moment of weakness, but a ritual repeated across generations. Her father was not the first to blur the lines between father and husband, nor was her mother the first to carry a child she should never have been asked to bear. Long before her birth, the family had already closed itself off from the world, marrying cousin to cousin, uncle to niece, father to daughter, until their lineage became a trap with no exit. What began as a way to keep the blood pure twisted into a cycle of corruption that warped the very faces of their children. The girl herself, fragile and silent, became the living symbol of that corruption. Villagers said that when she walked, her steps were unsteady, her speech broken. But behind her appearance, there was something that unsettled people even more, a strange stillness in her eyes, as though she understood far more than a child should. Some swore that when you met her gaze, it felt like looking at the entire history of her family's sins staring back at you. Yet no one stepped in. No authorities came knocking, no church intervened. Why? Because the family lived in a part of the country where isolation was a shield, in these forgotten hollows where the roads turned to dirt and the dirt turned to swamp, the law seldom wandered. Outsiders avoided the family and the family avoided them in return. It was easier to look away than to confront what was happening behind closed doors. Still, the rumors spread. Children in town would whisper about the girl with the wrong face. Parents would pull their kids close when the family came to market, and yet those same parents never spoke too loudly, never pointed fingers, because deep down, everyone knew that if the truth was dragged into daylight, it wouldn't just be the family who was shamed, it would be the whole community for letting it happen. And so the girl grew up not only as her father's child, but as a reminder of what silence can create. She was not just a daughter of incest, she was the embodiment of a crime too large for anyone to admit, As the years passed, the girl's existence became something of a ghost story. Travelers passing through the region would hear murmurs of her presence, though few ever saw her. She was said to linger in the doorway of her family's home, peering out with that unsettling gaze, as though watching but never stepping beyond the threshold. Those who did claim to see her often described a chilling sensation, a weight in the air, the kind that makes the hair on your neck rise before you even know why. One letter, tucked into the back pages of a local church archive, described her in words that feel more like an exorcism than a description. Her face is a mirror of too much sameness. Her body bent before it could grow. Her tongue makes words that sound familiar, but break apart before they are whole. And yet, her eyes, they see us. They judge us. It is this image of the girl that has endured, less as a person, more as a warning. She was never granted the dignity of childhood, never known outside of the sins that made her. Even her name has been stripped from the record. To speak of her now is to conjure an absence, a girl defined not by who she was, but by what was done to her. But the tragedy runs deeper, because she was not alone. Her siblings, yes, there were others, carried similar marks of a bloodline collapsing on itself. Some were stillborn, others frail, and the few who survived seemed to fade quickly, their bodies unable to carry the weight of such relentless repetition. Doctors of the time, if they ever examined them, would not have dared to record their findings. To do so would have meant exposing not only the family, but also the quiet complicity of the community. And so, the girl lived on, a survivor of a family that should never have continued. Those around her saw her as both cursed and inevitable, a living punishment for choices made long before she was conceived. It is said that in her silence she carried the burden of generations, that every crooked feature and halting step was history carved into flesh. The question that lingers is not simply how she came to be, but why no one stopped it. Was it fear? Was it denial? Or was it something far worse, an unspoken acknowledgement that families like hers existed everywhere, and exposing one meant exposing many? By the time she reached her teenage years, the girl had become less of a daughter and more of a symbol, a breathing reminder of what happens when bloodlines fold in on themselves too many times. The neighbors who once whispered about her as a curiosity now spoke of her in tones reserved for omens. Her face, her frail body, her halting speech. They were no longer just signs of inbreeding, but warnings carved into human form. Some stories say that her father, her grandfather, her captor, her parent, all at once, kept her close, as though she were not only his child, but also his possession. There are chilling accounts suggesting that the cycle did not end with her birth, that she too was forced into the same role her mother once played. If those stories are true, then she may have carried children of her own, each one born into the same shadow, each one another layer of silence the town refused to peel away. We may never know the full truth. The written record is nearly gone, and what survives exists only in the cracks of memory, in the mutterings of those who were too old to care about secrecy by the time they spoke. But every shred of evidence points to one fact. She was not an isolated case. She was part of a system, a closed loop of flesh and shame that went on far longer than any outsider realized. And what makes this story even more haunting is how normal it became to those within it. For her family, there was no line between father and husband, daughter and wife. Generations blurred into one continuous cycle of ownership and obedience. By the time she was born, the act that created her was not seen as crime or even sin. It was simply tradition. The same way a family might hand down land or furniture or a surname, this family handed down themselves. For the outside world, she became a story too uncomfortable to tell. To acknowledge her existence was to admit that such things were not relics of ancient history, not rare horrors from some distant land, but realities thriving in the soil of America itself. That is why she was erased. That is why her name is gone, because her existence was proof of something that society could not bear to confront, that even here, in the so-called land of progress, there were corners where humanity decayed into something almost unrecognizable. If you're still watching, you're already braver than most. Tell us in the comments, what would you have done if this was your bloodline? Would you have turned away, or would you have tried to end the cycle? The story of this girl forces us to confront not just the tragedy of her life, but the silence that allowed it to happen. Communities knew, neighbors saw, children whispered, and yet no one spoke loudly enough to break the cycle. It's easy to condemn the family for what they became, but what about the world around them, the world that looked away? What responsibility do we hold when we let horror grow in the dark, simply because it is easier not to see? This question echoes across time. In every generation, there are stories people choose not to tell, bloodlines warped by secrecy, legacies poisoned by denial, and always, there is a child at the center of it, born into a history that was decided long before their first breath. That is why the girl's story still matters, not because she was unique, but because she wasn't. We have fragments that hint at her fate. Some claim she died young, her frail body finally giving in to the damage written in her blood. Others believe she grew into adulthood, hidden away until the day she disappeared from the record completely. Whether she lived a short, painful life or a long, hidden one, the outcome is the same. She was erased. Erased by time, erased by shame, erased by a society that preferred forgetting to remembering. And yet, the erasure never fully succeeded. Her story persists in whispers and in shadows because deep down we know forgetting is dangerous. We know that if we bury stories like hers, we allow history to repeat itself. Silence is not protection. Silence is complicity. To some, she remains nothing more than a tragic curiosity, the most inbred girl in history. But that label reduces her to the very thing her family and community already forced upon her, a symbol of shame rather than a human being. She was a victim of a lineage that turned inward until it collapsed, and a victim of a society that turned outward until it looked away. And perhaps that is the darkest truth of all, that the story of her father's baby is not just about one family, but about all of us, and the things we would rather not see. The question that haunts this story is simple. Why was she remembered at all? If so much of her existence was erased, why do we still whisper about her? The answer may lie in the people who could not forget, the few who saw her, the few who wrote her down in the margins of history. They may not have spoken her name, but they left us fragments, like breadcrumbs scattered in the dark, daring us to follow. In those fragments, we catch glimpses of what her life must have been like. Imagine a young girl who never truly knew where family ended and where family began. Imagine growing up in a house where every face looked eerily like your own, where the words father, brother, husband, and child lost their meaning. In such a place, identity itself breaks down, and in her silence, in her hollow gaze, people saw the cost of such confusion. Some accounts describe how she would sit for hours, watching the woods beyond her family's home, as though longing for something she could not name. Others say she rarely smiled, and when she did, it unsettled those who saw it, because her smile carried too much pain, too much knowing for someone so young. Whether these are exaggerations or truths, the impression remains. She lived in a world of boundaries shattered, trapped in a bloodline that devoured itself. But her story is not only about tragedy, it is also about revelation. Because when we speak of her now, when we call her the most inbred girl in history, we are forced to confront the darkness in our own history, in our own communities. She forces us to ask, how many other families were erased? How many children were buried not only in the ground but in silence? And what does it say about us that we allow their stories to vanish? Her father's baby, unnamed, unremembered, becomes more than a figure of pity. She becomes a mirror, held up to us across centuries, reflecting back our own discomfort. We see in her what happens when tradition turns to obsession, when family turns to prison, when silence turns to complicity. And so, though her name has been stripped from the record, her shadow lingers. She is not gone. She is still here, watching, reminding us of what happens when we bury the truth too deep. Her story ends the way it lived, half in shadow, half in silence. No grave marker bears her name, no official document records her birth or her death. To history, she exists only as a rumor stitched together from fragments, a ghost who lingers because she was never allowed to fully live. And yet in that absence lies her power. She has become something larger than one girl, larger than one family. She has become a symbol of what we fear most, the truths we cannot look at directly. To call her her father's baby is to strip her of everything except the horror of her creation. But to remember her only that way is to repeat the crime of erasia. She was not just a curiosity, not just a grotesque artifact of a bloodline that collapsed on itself. She was a child who bore the weight of choices she never made, who lived in the wreckage of a family consumed by its own secrecy. Her tragedy is not entertainment. It is a warning. The reason this story unsettles us so deeply is because it is not safely locked in the past. We want to believe that horrors like this belong to some other time, some other place, but history whispers otherwise. Wherever families isolate themselves, wherever silence shields abuse, wherever shame is allowed to rot behind closed doors, stories like hers are born again. She is not just history, she is prophecy, if we refuse to learn. And that is why her shadow endures. Because she was more than a victim. She was proof. Proof that humanity, when left unchecked, can turn in on itself until it becomes unrecognizable. Proof that silence is more dangerous than violence. Proof that the darkest stories are not the ones we imagine, but the ones we choose to bury. Perhaps the final tragedy is this. She will never have justice, never have a name, never have peace, but she does have us, those who remember, those who refuse to let her story die. By speaking of her, by dragging her ghost back into the light, we deny the silence that consumed her family. We say that she lived, that she mattered, that her story cannot be erased. And so we close with this. In the forgotten corners of history, there are always eyes watching, waiting for someone brave enough to see. Tonight, you have seen, and once seen, you cannot look away. Thank you for watching. Don't forget to subscribe if you want more stories that history tried to bury. Until next time, remember, the past is never really gone. It waits.